Hey, this is Will, and in this lesson, we're going to be talking about what is the Kubernetes control plane. In this section of Kubernetes the hard way, our focus is going to be installing and configuring the Kubernetes control plane. So I wanted to just pause before we do that and give you a little bit of an idea of what that means and what it is that we're doing. The Kubernetes control plane is a set of services that control the Kubernetes cluster. So, like many orchestration products, Kubernetes has control servers and it has worker servers. And our worker nodes are going to be where our actual containers are going to run. The control nodes are responsible for performing all of the control and orchestration of the Kubernetes cluster. So we're going to be setting up those control servers in this section, and the Kubernetes control plane is the set of services that, when grouped together, provides that control functionality. The Kubernetes documentation says that the control plane components make global decisions about the cluster, for example, scheduling, and detect and respond to cluster events, such as starting up a new pod when a replication controller's replicas field is unsatisfied. So when it talks about scheduling there, that's simply talking about the process of finding a worker node and spinning up pods on that worker node. So the process of actually orchestrating and running our containers is scheduling, and the control plane coordinates that process. And things like spinning up a new pod when the replicas field is unsatisfied, that's talking about something like auto scaling or when we're running a deployment. So if I run a deployment and I say I want 4 replicas of this particular pod and the Kubernetes cluster only has 3 replicas, it's the control plane that is responsible for saying, hey, let's go ahead and spin up 1 more replica so that we have enough replicas to satisfy that requirement. So the control plane is essentially just providing all the orchestration functionality for our Kubernetes cluster. You can find more information about the control plane in the official Kubernetes documentation, and I've got a link there. You can also find that link in the description beneath this video. One more thing I want to talk about in this lesson is I want to talk about the actual control plane components, and I want to give just a very, very brief idea of what each of those components do. We're going to be installing most of these components, and I'm not going to go into any detail on these. Feel free to check out the documentation if you want to go more in depth, but I want you to have at least a basic idea of what each one of these things does so that you'll have some idea of what we're trying to accomplish as we go through the process of configuring the control plane. So the first component, and these are all services that are actually going to run on our control servers. The first component is Kube API Server, and that service basically just serves the Kubernetes API. So when we interact with the Kubernetes cluster, we're pretty much always utilizing the Kubernetes API. Even if you use kubectl on your local box, kubectl is communicating with the cluster using the API. So pretty much everything happens over the API. The API is the interface to the Kubernetes control plane and ultimately to the cluster itself. So Kube API Server is simply a service that serves and runs that API that allows us to interact with the cluster. There's also etcd, and etcd we've already installed, so we're not going to be installing that in this section because we installed and configured etcd in the previous section. And etcd is actually not strictly part of Kubernetes. It's a completely separate piece of open source software, but it is an essential part of a Kubernetes control plane because Kubernetes uses etcd, you may remember from the last section, as a distributed data store. So what keeps all of our multiple Kubernetes controllers in sync, what makes sure that they all have access to the same data store and that that data is synchronized across all nodes, that's etcd. Another service we'll be installing in this section is Kube Scheduler. And the scheduler, that terminology may be a little confusing if you're not very familiar with Kubernetes. When we talk about scheduling, we're talking about the process of finding a node where we can run a pod. So if I'm saying, hey, Kubernetes, I want to spin up a new pod, the Kube Scheduler is going to say, okay, let me find a worker node and let me tell that worker node, go ahead and spin up this pod. And that process of finding a worker node and spinning up the pod on that worker node is referred to as scheduling. So that's what the kube scheduler does, is it handles that process and manages that process. Another service that we're going to be setting up is the Kube Controller Manager. And Kube Controller Manager is really a collection of other pieces of the Kubernetes control plane called controllers. So it manages these multiple controllers, and that's why it's called the Kube Controller Manager. These different controllers provide a wide range of functionality, and essentially what the Kube Controller Manager does is it combines all of those into a single process, and that makes it a lot easier for us to install and manage Kubernetes because we have one process, whereas we could have several more instead of just Kube Controller Manager. If you want to find out what all the different controllers do, check out the Kubernetes documentation. But for right now, all you really need to know is that we have one service called the Kube Controller Manager that includes a bunch of smaller sub-services within it that are going to handle different functionality for the Kubernetes control plane. One more service that I'll talk about is the Cloud Controller Manager, and we're not actually going to install the Cloud Controller Manager in this course because it's only necessary for certain use cases. What the Cloud Controller Manager does is it handles interaction and integration with underlying cloud providers. So if you want to run Kubernetes directly on a cloud provider like Azure or Google Cloud Platform or Amazon Web Services, or even if you want to have a hybrid Kubernetes cluster where only some of your pods are running on cloud resources and you want to manage that interaction, that's the functionality that's provided by Cloud Controller Manager. So it provides just integration points and interaction points with underlying cloud services. We're not going to be utilizing that architecture in this course, so we have no need to install Cloud Controller Manager, but I wanted you to be aware of it in case in the future you end up in a situation where you want your Kubernetes cluster to also integrate with some kind of cloud platform. These control plane components are going to need to be installed on each controller node. So the ones that we're going to install are going to be installed on both controller nodes, and once we install and set up those services on our two controller nodes, we will have a distributed multi-node Kubernetes control plane. So I hope I've given you a basic understanding of what we're trying to accomplish in this section. Again, if you want more detail, feel free to check out the Kubernetes documentation. There's plenty of information there on what each of these components do and how they can be configured and managed.